Well, welcome to my talk number 11. I'm going to break it up into two parts. I was originally going to do this one talk, but I realized there's too much material for that. So this is 11A, and it's about industry and missionaries. Now, we'll start with industry because, in a sense, these are one of the great pivot points of history. I looked at the death of Christ and the Reformation as great pivot points, certainly in the kingdom of God. With regard to secular history, certain great pivot points might be considered the printing press, which unlocked knowledge in an avalanche, as it were, because it became easy to pass on books with information. And one could see a parallel to that with the advent of the internet at the end of the 20th century. Another great pivot point would be Christopher Columbus's exploration of South America, or discovery of that part of the world for the Europeans, because that opened up a whole new continent, or two continents really, and spurred on an exploration drive that made Europe a place that, you might say, exported its ideas around the world, primarily through empires, but also through its cultural institutions. The pivot point I'm looking at now in a little bit more detail is that of industry. Really up until the middle of the 18th century, industry such as weaving, such as nail making, blacksmiths, was done in someone's house. It was a domestic system, and usually the whole family contributed. If one looked at the textile industry, quite often the husband would be doing the weaving with his own weaving machine. The wife would be doing the spinning, and the children possibly be involved in the carding and preparing of, and once, let's say, look at cotton, preparing cotton to be used. Now, all that changed in the case of cotton with the invention of the spinning frame that Richard Arkwright developed in about 1770. Now that was such a big machine with so many spindles that it required a specialist building to house it, and it required a water wheel to drive the power to make the machine work. Suddenly, people no longer worked at home, they worked in a factory. And in many cases, the husbands, the wives, and the children would work in different factories, thus breaking up the family unit. And the work that was done no longer had the craftsmanship that the old type of work had. And I can understand Marx's comment about alienation when he wrote that this work was alienating to the human soul. In a sense, we had been dehumanized by this process. And many of the romantics bewailed this. And obviously, later on, we discovered that this very process created huge amounts of pollution and destroyed the environment. So not only did it destroy the family in many ways, at least weaken it, it destroyed the environment. It gave birth to a consumer culture eventually, but it also gave birth to incredible wealth. And so we have to realize that the world we live in today, for better or worse, is very much a product of that industrialization process, with all the positives as well as the negatives. Now, I want to consider the other big change in the period that we're looking at, which is basically the 17th, 18th, and 19th century, and that is the missionaries. Because it's really important to understand that in this period of history, there was an incredible awakening taking place. This started, I suppose, really in the period of the 18th century with people like John and Charles Wesley, who set up Methodism. And this movement spread to North America, and I believe there were parallel movements in Europe as well. And these movements, it is said, prevented a revolution taking place in Britain. I don't think that's a contested point of view, but it's a point of view that is advanced, because many of the workers, by the time the French Revolution took place in Britain, had become Methodists and had established a sort of quiet confidence in God that didn't make them susceptible to revolutionary fervor. This awakening of the spiritual life in Britain also affected the political classes, albeit slowly. And this is most evidently seen in Wilberforce and what's called the Clapham sect, who essentially advanced moral causes within the British parliamentary system. And the most successful of that was, of course, the anti-slavery movement, or first of all, the abolition of the slave trade in 1807, and finally the abolition of slavery in the British Empire in 1833. The 1807 one is amazing because that took place in the middle of a titanic existential conflict with France. And for a country to embark upon a policy that could be seen as destructive to its economic interests, for moral reasons, suggested there being a very powerful moral effect. Likewise, 1833, the abolition of slavery was extremely costly to the British government because effectively they had to buy the slaves off the slave owners. And I think the British Treasury said that they finally paid off the bill, something like 2015. Leading on from that, the British taxpayers paid for a Royal Navy squadron to police the West African coast for the next 50 years to ensure that slavery didn't take place. So this moral urgency was born out of these evangelical revivals impacting a nation. We then see it in the work of people like Lord Shaftesbury, who tirelessly worked to reduce the inhuman hours that people were expected to work in the factories, and the fact that children were sent down to work in the mines and often work in the factories under the age of 10. He also worked to make sure that there was at least a level of education given to the poorest and that the poorest needs were met. Another good example is George Muller, who saw the huge number of orphans and children left abandoned in Bristol and felt moved to set up orphanages. What's interesting about George Muller is that by the time he'd finished, he had orphanages looking after 2,000 children. But he never let his needs be known by anyone. He never advertised his needs. He purely prayed and trusted God. And it's one of the great miracles of the Victorian period that George Muller always found that the food came in. One story tells when he is waiting to have breakfast with his children and there is no food. And then there's a knock on the door just after they've said grace, with no food being present. And a man who's the baker comes in with lots of bread. And he says, God woke him up in the middle of the night and told him to bake the bread and sent it off to George Muller. I can imagine these types of events would have been incredibly confidence building and faith building. The missionary movement also springs up at this time. And we have an amazing example of William Carey, who's probably one of the earliest of the missionaries of this period. There were incredible missionaries from the Moravian Church who started doing mission work back in the early 1700s. But in terms of British missionary movement, I think one could look to the work of William Carey. And I'm going to, in this, start by looking at a book that I've got here, which is by Vishal Manguardi, and I'll bring it up on my PowerPoint presentation. It really takes someone who is from a Hindu background to see clearly what maybe those who are almost too immersed in our culture see. And that's the incredible effect of the Bible. Because in one sense, we're almost so used to it. And in this, Vishnu comes up with a very good example of a person who has history. And it's loading up. And this is the book I'm referring to, and I'm going to read from it. And it's referring to William Carey, and it's page 170 I'm reading from. I do recommend buying the book because it is so good. 3 English missionaries, William Carey, Joshua Marshman, and William Ward, began the work of learning hundreds of dialects spoken by illiterate Indians in order to turn them into 73 literary languages and to create their grammars and dictionaries. The impact in creating modern South Asia was best summarized by historian Hugh Tinker. And so in Serampore, on the banks of the Huey, soon after 1800, the principal elements in modern South Asia, popular linguistic identification, linguism, the press, the university, social consciousness, all came to light. The West and South Asia were about to come to grips with each other in terms not merely of power and profit, but also ideas and principles. The Serampore trio, as the missionaries were known, began with Bible translations and then established a college that grew into Serampore University. They chose to use Bengali rather than English as the medium of instruction in their college because the missionaries noticed that Indian families wanted their children to learn only enough English to get a job with the East India Company. The missionaries had not dedicated their lives to producing good English-speaking servants for the British Raj. They wanted Indians to come to the college to begin cultivating their minds and their spirits, to question the socio-economic darkness around them, to inquire and to find the truth that liberates individuals and builds great nations. The Bible teaches that the Creator gave us the gift of language because he loved us. Love includes communication, and communication of great ideas requires great language. And using testimony to how very often those missionaries went out to different countries, and in their love for the people that they were going to, they not only brought medicine, not only brought education, but they also often brought the ability to take a language that had become, as it were, illiterate. Nobody had learnt to write it and put it into a written form, though I suspect originally it wasn't a written form. But they managed to take that language and turn it into a written form. And so many of the written languages today owe their origin to missionaries. What an amazing effect they had. Now, Christians also had an effect upon business. And I want to have a little look there. Well, actually, before I get to business, I'll come to football. I was originally going to go to business, but we'll go to football first. So, you wouldn't think football would be a major inspiration from Christianity, but it was. In the Premiership, there are about a quarter of the clubs in the English Premiership that owe their origin as church clubs. And this book written by Peter Lupson a few years ago, who's a member of the church I belong to, called Thank God for Football, has been very warmly received by these clubs. And here's an example of the clubs that have their origins in, as I say, churches who it's all part of muscular Christianity. This attempt to try and persuade people that getting drunk is not a good use of your time. So instead, why not do something constructive? And so the examples of these teams would be Aston Villa, Barnsley, Birmingham City, Bolton Wanderers, Everton, Liverpool, Fulham, Manchester City, Queen's Park Rangers, Southampton, Swindon, and Tottenham Hotspur. And I want to just quickly look at the example of Manchester City because I think it's really interesting. It was in 1789 at St. Mark's Church that a positive step was taken to address the problems of young people not having enough to do. Anne Connell The rector's eldest daughter, now a young woman of 24, decided something had to be done. She was grieved by the wretched existence of the men of the parish and the aimlessness of their lives, and wanted to help. What did she do? She resolved to set up a weekly working men's meeting, offering a program of spiritually edifying talks and wholesome entertainment, consisting of musical evenings, concerts, singing, drama, reading, and recitations. These were typical forms of amusement at this time. And really, this young woman was the person in doing that who set up a football club that became Manchester City Football Club. Amazing, amazing. We find in the world of business, there was also an incredible number of businesses who were set up by Christians. And Peter Lupson, again, has written this book called In God's Company. And this is what he has to say. Business is business. In the fierce white heat of competition, this statement declares that personal feelings or moral considerations can be suspended in the pursuit of profit. As in love and war, all's fair in business. Or is it? Not according to the 7 giants of business, who are the subjects of this book. Each of them, world leaders in their field, built empires worth billions, but did so with absolute integrity, caring about the quality of their products, service to their customers, and the treatment of their employees. There was no shady dealings. They didn't have it easy. On their way to staggering success, they endured skepticism and ridicule, bitter opposition, and in some cases, terrible personal tragedy. They all suffered severe financial reverses, and some even knew the stigma of bankruptcy. Yet despite devastating setbacks, the word impossible never featured in their vocabulary. Nor did they resort to moral shortcuts to achieve their aims, not even in the worst of times. What was the secret of their success? These brilliant businessmen publicly acknowledged that they drew their courage, strength, and wisdom to turn difficulties into opportunities and disasters into triumphs. From their personal relationships with Jesus Christ, in response to their prayers, they knew he would guide them in all their decision making, in good times and in bad. And, you could recognize this. Colgate as the toothpaste, Cooks, Thomas Cooks, the travel agents. Crow was the one who produced Quaker Oats. Hartley is the jam producer. Heinz, famous for his baked beans, but much else. Kraft, a huge, great food empire. And Rossi was the maker of Tropicana. And really, I want to just give you one example. William Hartley. Hartley is from the north of England, and he is from Colne, and he is very much a man who was very honest and upright in his dealings and looked after his workers and had great desire to produce a good product. And this is what he said towards the end of his life. My last word must be that we, followers of Jesus Christ, must carry out into our lives his spirit and teaching, and that whatever we think Jesus Christ would have done had he been in our place, whether we are employees or employers, whether we are in business or out of business, that we are compelled to do. This is the secret of all true success, the consecration of ourselves and our substance to him who loved us and laid down his life for us. These people showed amazing courage and spiritual strength, and as a result laid down strong foundations. But they were all of them inspired by a belief that the Bible was a revelation from God. And it's with that I want to conclude this talk. Going back to what Vishal said, he was someone who believed that the Bible genuinely provided that type of foundation on which Western civilization depended. And when he wrote this book, he was afraid that the West was losing confidence in the Bible, turning away from it, and as a result, undermining its very foundations. And he felt it was really important to remind people that they did not get the world they have today if it was not for the Bible. And he basically outlined all the areas he felt the Bible impacted Western thinking and through it the rest of the world. It was the Bible that basically gave us a concept of a soul, the idea of service, that there was an eternal quest that was of real significance, gave us a concept of who we were, a sense of what it was to be human, a basis for rationality, inspired technology, gave a framework for heroism that was very different to what was there before, inspired a great love of languages and literature, gave a sense of purpose to education, gave a framework for science, which we'll look at in our next talk. Obviously, gave us an understanding of morality, a basis for family life, for compassion, for an understanding of what true wealth was all about, and gave us a framework as well for liberty. You'd be surprised to what extent the Bible framed our modern world, and many of the great things that we take as being real privileges in our modern world derived from people who took the Bible seriously. And that's really part of the rationale for these talks, is to, as it were, establish that the Bible is a true and authoritative revelation from God. And the fruit of that revelation can be seen in the good works that have come out of people who believed the Bible and took it seriously. Thank you for listening. And again, I will need to close down. As I say, it takes me a bit of time to do that.